Hey guys, welcome back to another Destiny 2 video. Today's video is a Warlock build guide that I'm very excited to share with you because it's basically a build that I've just been waiting to showcase, and I've been waiting for a few buffs to come in as well as the new artifact mods to come out, and now that it has, it's easily my favorite build on Warlock. It's a build that specializes in massive super regen, as well as ability spam and transcendence buildup, while also featuring good gunplay and weapon support to complement that super regen and those abilities. This is something I've already used to solo the GM this week, and it's something that's easily becoming my favorite build on Warlock. We have a lot to go over today, so let's get right into the subclass. On to Prismatic Warlock. For your super, go with Storm Trance. Normally, Storm Trance isn't a super I'd really recommend anywhere, especially when compared to stuff like Needle Storm, Nova Bomb, or Song of Flame on Prismatic, but there's two reasons we're mainly using Storm Trance. The first is when combined with our exotic, it enables a massive amount of super regen, and two, this actually got multiple massive buffs going into this act. The first thing they did was basically allow this super, as well as other specific supers, to basically get 3 times the super regen from causing damage ticks. Meaning that basically if you're causing a bunch of AoE damage and dealing multiple instances of damage at the same time, you're basically getting 3 times the super regen you normally would from that. In addition, they also buffed this by around 30 to 50%. They didn't explicitly say where in that range it fell in, but they buffed its damage against champions by that amount. So this basically got a massive super regen increase, as well as a free 30% minimum damage boost against champions. We're gonna take this damage boost even further by using some other artifact mods and other perks in our subclass, but just keep in mind, this thing has gotten a lot better since the start of this new act. Onto your abilities, I'm personally using Phoenix Dive, but you really can use whichever you prefer with this build. I just like using Phoenix Dive as an instant cure option, and one that allows me to be more mobile with my gameplay. You don't have to kind of sit there and wait for Healing Rift to heal you. You can kind of just pop Phoenix Dive, and then you're pretty much at full health and you're good to go. For your melee ability, go with Penumbral Blast. This is something I normally wouldn't recommend for PvE, but for this build in particular, we could take advantage of stasis debuffs to massively buff our super damage, and this is a very easy way to just get a quick stasis debuff on an enemy. With that in mind, you could also use something like Arcane Needle if you wanted a more long-range melee option with also 3 melee charges, but again, Penumbral just fits in a lot better with what we're doing, but with that said, you can use either. And then finally for our grenade, we're using Storm Grenade. This is absolutely key with this build, as not only is this the grenade that's going to be causing a ton of individual damage ticks, but it also jolts enemies thanks to the fragment we're pairing with it, and this is one of the ways we're going to get a ton of super regen with this build. As in short, as long as you're jolting enemies, you get a massive boost to your super regen, your grenade regen, and you massively enhance the time of your super with our exotic. Onto the aspects, the first one is Feed the Void. In short, defeat any target with an ability to activate Devour, and anytime you get a kill then, you get basically free health on that kill, as well as improved grenade energy every time you get a defeat. So again, this pairs nicely with our Storm Grenade because just getting kills will give us grenade energy. Our Storm Grenade will also jolt targets, which with our exotic will give us a base 500% grenade and super regen, so this fits in perfectly. What this means is that just by using our grenade and some decent weapon supports, we can basically go from 0 super energy to full super in about 20 seconds. The other aspect I'm using is Helion. You might be a bit confused why this is here, and I'll basically explain real quick. Helion is a very easy way to support this build by having Scorching and Igniting effects, contributing to some more AoE damage basically for free. And it also scorches and ignites enemies, which can be good for like champion staggering or just causing decent AoE damage without us having to worry too much about it. The main reason I'm not using something like Lightning Surge, which is probably what you would mostly expect with this build, is because Lightning Surge is an interesting effect. Would this help us jolt targets and get a lot more super energy? Probably. The problem is that this basically takes you out of any kind of cover you might have and forces you to play hyper aggressive. Not that this build can't do that, but the main issue is that Lightning Surge doesn't do a lot of damage. And so in higher end difficulty and stuff like GMs, for example, unless what you're jolting is something like an Overload champion, which this will stagger then, they're most likely going to shrug this off. And because of that, you're basically putting yourself in danger just to jolt targets, when realistically, again, we can just do that from a range. So again, Helion is basically just there for free Scorching and Ignition, as well as just some more AoE damage ticks that we really don't have to worry about. Onto our fragments, the first one is going to be Faceted Protection, basically giving us a damage resistance anytime we're surrounded by enemies, and while we're Transcendent, this effect is increased. We're also pairing this with Facet of Hope, which anytime we have an elemental buff, our class ability regenerates a lot more quickly. This is a 60% class ability regen boost, and this works really nice because we're basically always going to be amplified with this build. We also have Facet of Purpose, which anytime we pick up an Orb of Power with this build, it'll make us amplified. Next up is Facet of Courage, which allows our Arc, Solar, and Void abilities to deal 10% more damage to enemies afflicted by a Darkness debuff. This is why using something like Penumbral Blast is so good with this build, because combined with the artifact mods, lets this thing hit incredibly hard. With that said, if you don't want to use Facet of Courage, there are definitely alternatives you can fit in here. Stuff like Facet of Dawn comes to mind, where you can just basically get a free 25% damage boost for your weapons, as well as helping you be Radiant, which can deal with barrier champions. But again, it's entirely up to you. With how often we're spamming Transcendence and our super with this build, just investing in a Facet of Courage is a lot more valuable than it was before. The final fragment is Facet of Dominance, which is crucial to this build. The first thing this does is allow our Storm Grenade to jolt targets, which allows it to deal more AoE damage ticks, which in turn generates more super energy. Briefly going over the artifact mods I'd actually recommend using with this build. The first one I want to showcase is Trace Evidence. Rapid precision hits or final blows on targets affected by Jolt or Blind will generate Ionic Traces. Ionic Traces are really nice because they don't give you one specific kind of energy, like picking up a Fire Sprite or a Void Breach will. These will give you universal ability energy, although it's a bit lower. Thankfully with this build, we're generating so many Ionic Traces that we can generate all of our abilities back incredibly quickly, even ones that aren't being boosted by our exotic or something like Devour's Enhanced Ability Regen. The next mod is the Thick of It. Rapid final blows while surrounded will grant you armor charge. This actually can come off of anything. This can come off of ability kills, weapon kills, super kills, and so with us using Storm Trance, which is primarily a large AoE damaging roaming super, this lets us generate a ton of armor charge stacks very quickly, and we need a ton of armor charge stacks because of our other artifact mods. That artifact mod is Retinal Burn. Rapid arc precision hits consume an armor charge stack to blind a target. This can be boosted with a tonic effect, which actually makes that blinding effect an AoE burst rather than an on-target hit. But basically, anytime that you have a stack of armor charge and you're dealing damage with an arc weapon, specifically rapid precision hits, this will cause that target to be blinded. There are some weapons that can do this on hit and will therefore bypass the armor charge requirement, but for most sources I'd recommend using primarily with this build, this will allow most arc weapons to basically blind for free. And so building up our armor charge stacks very quickly is crucial. The main synergy between these two is that with the Thick of It, you can activate your super, go out and kill a ton of enemies with it, and that'll give you a bunch of stacks of armor charge. And then whenever your super's over, you then have multiple armor charge stacks ready for Retinal Burn, which can then instantly blind targets. What this means is that you can stack jolting effects and blinding effects on the same weapon. And if you have something like jolting feedback like I do, that means your weapon now blinds and jolts on hit, which automatically takes care of 2 champion types and specializes in a ton of damage as well as status conditions. The other one I recommend is Concussive Reload. Anytime you use a grenade launcher to damage a boss, a champion, or break a combatant shield, it weakens them. This is basically a free 15% debuff, which again we can pair with something like Conductive Cosmic Crystal and our Fragment to deal a ton of burst damage against champions specifically, as well as stuff like mini bosses. The other mods I would recommend are Conductive Cosmic Crystal. Your arc abilities, void abilities, and weapons with the Dark Ether Reaper origin trait do more damage to enemies that are debuffed by a stasis debuff. For our purposes, this is basically a free 5% damage bonus with this build for our arc abilities, specifically our landfall ability when we activate our super. The final mod I'd recommend using is Arc Compounding, and this one is incredibly important. Arc Compounding lets arc sources deal 15% more damage to blinded targets. This is why having something like Retinal Burn and combining it with the Thick of It is so important, because it basically lets us set up a damage boosting effect against specific champions by just simply blinding them with our arc weapon. And as we're chaining our super and other effects, this is basically a free 15% damage bonus. So again, if we weaken an enemy, specifically a champion, and then blind them with our weapon, we now have a 15% debuff, a 15% damage boost, a 5% damage boost that actually gets stronger with the tonic, I believe it's 8%, and then a 10% damage bonus with our subclass Fragment. All of these are buffing Landfall's damage, which, keep in mind, got a minimum 30% damage increase with the last patch. Not to mention that this will also buff any arc weapon that is also dealing that damage. So if you wanted to, that arc weapon that I mentioned earlier that can jolt and blind now is just 15% stronger at base. Getting on to the armor and the subclass then for today, briefly touching on our helmet mods, Heavy Ammo Finder just to support our exotic weapon. Depending upon which one you choose, and I do have multiple recommendations towards the end of the video, swap this out for a special or heavy weapon depending on which way you go. The next mod is Power Preservation, which will allow our super to regen an additional orb of power about every 1.5 seconds. With how long this build actually keeps our super up for, which is additional 65% duration, means that we can generate a ton of orbs with this mod alone. For the exotic itself, it's Crown of Tempest, and Crown of Tempest is a perfect exotic with this build. In short, short, anytime we get an arc ability or a jolt final blow, it increases the recharge rate of our arc abilities, and it increases the duration of Storm Trance. Like I mentioned earlier, the regen is 500%, which stacked on top of the base buffs to the Storm Trance super regen means we get our super back incredibly quickly. The duration increase for Storm Trance is actually 65%, meaning we can have our super being actively used for up to 25 seconds. So again, not only are we getting our super back a lot faster, it's lasting a lot longer, and with stuff like power preservation, we're generating a ton of warps for our allies. For our gauntlets, the first mod is Harmonic Loader, just to buff the reload speed of our arc weapons, again just naturally supporting our weapons a bit. The next one is Fastball, just to allow us to throw our grenade further. I wish this wasn't something we needed to do, but hey, without it, we're not really throwing our grenade too far. We're also using Bolstering Detonation, which grants us class ability energy anytime we cause damage with our grenade. For our chest piece, this is kind of up to you and the content that you're in, and I do have another recommendation compared to what I normally do. Normally I say some kind of combination of resists and reserves depending upon the activity that you're in, but you also might want to go with Charged Up, which just allows you to increase your armor charge stack by 1, bringing us from 3 to 4 at base, and this can bring us to 5 or 6 respectively depending on how many stacks of Charged Up you have. Depending upon how easy it is for you to blind targets, for example if the arc weapon you're using has some intrinsic way to blind targets, this becomes less important for you, but if you don't have any way to really do so besides the fragment, you might want to invest in this a little bit more because then you're going to be taking advantage of that a lot more often. So in short, depending upon the weapons you use and how easy blinding is for you to apply, you might want to invest in charged up stacks, maybe 1 or 2 of them, and then pair a reserve or a resist depending upon the activity that you're in. For me, I found 1 of each to be best, and even with stuff like a solo GM run, this is what ended up working for me. For our legs, the first mod is Recuperation, which allows us to get health anytime we pick up an Orb of Power. This isn't necessary with this build, and it's something I mainly just threw in there to help with survivability, so with that said, you can swap this out for another mod if you want to. The other mod I'm going with is an Arc Weapon Surge, just to benefit our arc weapon damage by giving it a 10% damage bonus anytime we have a stack of Armor Charge. And anytime that we use a stack of Armor Charge based on the artifact perk, we often have 2 or 3 just kind of sitting in the background that are quickly refilled. So with a Weapon Surge, this is just a nice way to actually use those additional Armor Charge stacks we might not be fully taking advantage of, while also benefiting our arc weapon damage. And the final mod I'm using to help all of this come together is Elemental Charge. Anytime you collect a Fire Sprite, Ionic Trace, Stasis Shard, Void Breach, or you destroy a Tangle, it gives you an escalating chance to get a stack of Armor Charge. With how often we're generating Ionic Traces with this build, we can get a ton of Armor Charge stacks just by simply getting kills, because these Ionic Traces will actually seek us out directly. We don't have to go and pick them up, they'll find their way to us. And then finally onto the bond. The first one I'm using is Powerful Attraction, just to instantly pick up any nearby orbs of power whenever we use our Phoenix Dive for instant healing, as well as activating Helion. I'm pairing this with Reaper, which after we activate our class ability, the next final weapon blow that we get will guaranteed spawn an Orb of Power. And the final one is Distribution, which just improves our ability regen when we use our class ability for all 3 of our abilities. Finally, onto the weapons with this build. This is kind of the hardest section of this build because I hate to use the term anything that jolts or arc weapon, but that's realistically the limitations of this build. There are so many weapons that this build works fantastic with that I'm going to focus on a few specific exotics that work well, and then a certain archetype of weapons that you can use with this build. The first thing I want to focus on is anything that can jolt in any way. That, in my opinion, is the best weapon to use with this build. Anything that can jolt. There are a few weapons I would recommend. My personal favorite is the new Vesper's Host Auto Rifle, and the specific role you want on this is jolting feedback and attrition orbs, because simply dealing damage with this weapon will cause it to jolt targets, and while you're amplified, the jolt is applied faster, which, again, we are always amplified with this build. Pairing this with attrition orbs means that as we deal damage, not only will we eventually jolt that target, but we'll get a free orb out of it. This pairs really nicely with something like Synergy, which final blows with this weapon have a chance to create an Ionic Trace, meaning that as we get kills with this weapon, we're generating multiple Ionic Traces from multiple sources. We're also jolting and therefore blinding a target, and as we deal damage, we're also getting Orbs of Power. This specific combination can't really be found on a lot of other weapons, and it's so good. Again, it's all activating on hit. Synergy is the mod, and that's the only thing that's activating on kill here. We're getting Orbs of Power on hit. We're getting jolting and therefore blinding on hit. We're getting Ionic Traces generated on hit. This is an incredible weapon to use. I initially actually started out with a different exotic in the energy slot, But using this is just so easy, and it's just so beneficial with this build that I cannot recommend this specific role enough if you haven't. Another new addition you can also use is something like Vantage Point, which is a Dark Ether Reaper weapon, meaning it gets some additional benefits we went over in the artifact perks, but also this is a pulse rifle that can roll with something like Jolting Feedback as well. So again, variety of rolls you can get on this weapon. Jolting Feedback is just such a good perk to use with this build because it's jolting on hit. So pretty much any weapon with Jolting Feedback is perfect, and I cannot recommend it enough. In addition to that, any weapon with Volt Shot also works fantastic. Tarnished Metal is a very, very old scout rifle that is craftable. It's something I haven't used in a while just because I found kind of better options I like. But again, Volt Shot and Shoot to Loot are both really good combinations with this build. And again, Volt Shot is just basically Jolting Feedback, but you have to get a kill and reload to activate it. But again, once you get that chain going, it's very, very easy to continually chain Volt Shot over and over and over again. It's just with something like the Vesper's Host Auto Rifle, it's just kind of on hit and for free. But again, Volt Shot or Jolting Feedback are two perks that on any weapon work with this build. If you have a weapon like, for example, from the same season that Tarnished Metal came from, it's a small sidearm. I can't remember the name of it, but it's basically like Feeding Frenzy and Volt Shot is the perk combination you can roll on that. You can use that with this build. Any weapon with Volt Shot, any weapon with Jolting Feedback is fantastic. And the reason I say that is because keep in mind, any weapon that can jolt will also intrinsically blind, will also make its own ionic traces, and gets a free 15% damage bonus. So as long as the weapon can jolt, it can get all of those benefits. And in addition, it also activates Crown of Tempest, which gives a 500% regen bonus to our grenade and our super, which again plays into the quick super regen. You see where all this is kind of chaining together really nicely. Anything that can jolt in any capacity is perfect. So if you have a specific weapon that is kind of really niche, but you like it and it jolts, use it with this build. It'll work perfectly. Another weapon you might want to consider using is pretty much any good darkness damage source, just because a lot of our intrinsic effects like Helion or our Arc Grenade or our Super are all light-based damage. So anything that is darkness-based is actually pretty good with this build. I'm personally going with Lost Signal because being a auto-loading grenade launcher, it has a ton of benefits with the artifact perk, mainly activating as a weakening source. Plus again, it's a stasis weapon, so it builds up darkness meter very effectively. For your power weapon, any decent arc heavy works really well. Wendigo is kind of my go-to option. I have mine with Field Prep and Explosive Light. Heavy GLs are just so good right now, especially with the artifact perk, allowing them to debuff on hit for exotic alternatives to weapons. The first one I want to look at is Cold Heart in the energy slot. Now, this isn't my number one pick, but it is worth noting that this is the easiest to use. This is something that if you don't really have any good seasonal weapons or specific craftable weapons that can roll with Jolting Feedback or Volt Shot, this is something most players kind of just have, even free-to-play players, that will work really nicely with this build. The main reason is that even though it can't jolt enemies, it gets free ionic traces with Longest Winter, and that means that you can build up your grenade back even faster on hit, which then in turn will jolt those enemies. So in short, it's not the best weapon I would recommend for this build, but it's very easy to use being a trace rifle, so once you are jolting enemies and getting those ionic traces, it's very easy for then this weapon to blind enemies, and that blinding will also give it a free 15% damage bonus. So again, not the best weapon, but this is something that every player will have and works really nicely with this build, because it enhances the other aspects, even though on its own it's not that great. The other exotic alternative is Delicate Tomb. This one's fantastic just because it pairs really nicely with Ionic Trace generation, as anytime we pick up an Ionic Trace, it causes the next shot to actually jolt targets on hit. The other nice part about it being a fusion rifle is that it's a multi-hit projectile, meaning that causing damage with this weapon is going to have even more super regen because of the damage tick changes with Storm Trance. Overall, it's a nice fit. It's just not really something I would personally prefer using if you have a good Volt Shot or Jolting Feedback weapon, but again, it is perfectly viable with a build like this. Another exotic I personally want to go over is the Queenbreaker. Now, if you're like me, you haven't touched this in forever, and you're probably wondering why is this here on the video, and personally, it's not the best option that you can go with, but I actually really like using it, and I just personally like the weapon in general with this build, so it's actually what I'm using. Again, you don't have to use Queenbreaker though. The main reason I'm using it is just because of its main perk that allows it to chain blinding onto targets on hit. The main reason that this is good is because with the artifact mod, Retinal Burn, this can then be saved for a more direct bolt shot or jolting feedback weapon. Meaning that what this is doing is it won't consume our armor charge stacks as we use Queenbreaker, but we can still get the large AoE blinding chain going. And because we're dealing rapid precision damage with the weapon, that means we can also generate ionic traces because it's automatically blinding those same targets. And then of course, as we blind targets on hit, it's getting a free 15% damage bonus with arc compounding. So it just kind of fits in really nicely with this build by doing the same effects without taking the resources that this build utilizes to have those effects. And what this does is still let us get those same blinding effects, get the same ionic traces, the damage bonus, everything, without taking away from our jolting feedback or bolt shot weapon, which is the primary catalyst behind implementing those effects. All in all, guys, that's the build for the day. Like I mentioned earlier, this is already a build I've used to solo this week's GM, and it's quickly become my favorite Warlock build in the entire game. It's something I'm always going to have on me, and it's something I'm definitely going to be enjoying for the rest of this episode. Dim link is down in the description for you guys to try this build out for yourself. Let me know in the comments what you think of it, as well as any recommendations for future build guides. As always, thank you guys so much for watching. I greatly appreciate the continued support on these videos, and I'll catch you in the next one. Thank you so much, and have a great day.